Welcome back to Life's Chillent. My name is Avital, and this week's Parshat is Parshat Vayigash. Parshat Vayigash is a really beautiful Parsha, and it opens with Joseph revealing his true identity to his brothers who had come to him in Egypt and hadn't recognized him because it's been many years and now he's viceroy over Egypt and he's speaking in a foreign language and they didn't recognize him. They couldn't imagine him in this context. And so Joseph finally he sees that his brothers have truly changed as people, that they are standing up for one another in a way that they didn't stand up for him when he had been sold into slavery and gone to Egypt. He sees that they've really repented, they've changed their ways, they are there for one another, and so he tells them who he is. He can't restrain himself anymore, and he finally tells them that he's Joseph, their brother. And as you can imagine, the brothers are quite surprised, but something that I've found to be so beautiful and so meaningful in this Parsha is what Joseph tells his brothers before they even have a chance to respond or to speak to what after he says that I'm Joseph, your brother. So I'm going to read it directly from the Parsha, from the Torah portion, because he says it so well. It says, Joseph said to his brothers, "Come close to me if you please." And they came close. And he said, "I am Joseph, your brother. It is me whom you sold into Egypt. And now, be not distressed, nor reproach yourselves for having sold me here, for it was to be a provider that God sent me ahead of you. For this has been 2 of the hunger years in the midst of the land, and there are yet 5 years in which there will neither be plowing nor harvest. Thus God has sent me ahead of you to ensure your survival in the land and to sustain you for a momentous deliverance. And now it was not you who sent me here, but God." So this is really, really amazing because Joseph has such a wonderful perspective on all that he's been through. As a quick recap, he got sold into slavery in Egypt. Once in Egypt, he was a slave, and as a slave, he was sort of falsely accused of trying to assault a woman and got put into prison, where he spent a really long time in prison. And in prison, he sort of made these friends who sort of forgot about him, and thus he was in prison for even longer. And then finally, eventually, he sort of rose up out of prison and became this great man in Egypt, viceroy, number 2 in Egypt, but he had to endure quite a bit. He had to endure quite a bit of suffering to get to this point. And yet his perspective when his brothers, who hadn't helped him when he cried out from the pit in Egypt, and who, sold him into slavery, when he sees them again for the first time after all of these years, his response isn't one of anger. His response isn't one of like, how could you do this to me? You sold me into slavery. I'm going to forget you. I'm not going to help you. He doesn't have any sort of residual hatred or ill feelings towards his brothers. He's forgiven them. He's come to this place of peace, sort of where he's forgiven them and been able to realize that they were sort of a means to an end, in the sense of his brothers had to act the way they did. He had to be sold into slavery so that he could be there in Egypt, so that he could rise through the ranks, so that he could provide for his family during the famine. And so he is able to step back and remove those emotions, those deep emotions from this situation that he's been in, and say, if I had not been sold into slavery, our family probably would have starved and died during this famine. It's an amazing perspective. It's something that's so difficult to do. I recognize that at times it can be hard to look at a story from the Bible and decide how we can apply it to our lives, because Joseph is, he's written about in the Bible. He's this great man who had this level of holiness that he could look at what his brothers did to him and understand that it was really God who led these events to happen, and that he forgave his brothers for everything that they did. That's a really high level. And sometimes it's hard to feel like we can connect to that or we can emulate those traits. And so I want to share a personal example that I think will show you also just another way in which we can try and look at bad events and see how they ultimately led to something good. The story is actually about how my parents met. So my father's father, my grandfather, he passed away when he was very young. He was still in his 50s. And after that, my dad decided that it would be a good idea for him to get a change of scenery, a change of pace. And so he decided that he was going to travel with one of his friends to Europe. And it got to the point when they were traveling that they needed someplace to stay for Shabbat because observant Jews, they don't travel on the Sabbath, on Shabbat. They take that day off and they rest. And they needed someplace to stay. And my dad's friend, he knew a family in France because he had met what turns out to be my mom's sister on a trip in Israel and had become friends with them and had come to stay with them a couple of times before in France. And so my dad's friend said, look, I know this nice Jewish family in France and we can stay with them. And so sure enough, my dad and his friend went to spend Shabbat with my mom's family and they stayed at her house. And the rest is kind of history. And thankfully now my parents have been married for 38 years and going on 39 soon. It's a beautiful story. But what you have to look at is there was an undeniably sad event there. My dad's loss of his father, the loss of my grandfather. That was a tragedy, something that is clearly, purely just something that is sad. But you can look at that and you can say, at the same time, if that hadn't happened, why would my dad have reason to travel in Europe? Why would he be in France? Why would he be spending Shabbat at some random person's family if he hadn't been with his friend, if he hadn't lost his dad, if he hadn't felt the need to travel, if they didn't need someplace to be for Shabbat? How all these things that had to line up in order for my dad to meet my mom, and the catalyst, the beginning point, was my grandfather's death. And so it's not to negate something that is sad, it's not, or something that is tragic, or something that's difficult. It's not to say, oh, that was a good thing that it happened. Not at all. It was definitely bad, difficult things that happened. But it's once those difficult things happen to you that you have to look at your perspective. You have to try to view it with another lens and say, something bad happened to me. This was something sad. And then you have to try to look for ways in which it has shaped your life in a positive way. I know that's something difficult to do. I know it's something difficult to look at Joseph, to look at this betrayal in his family and say, this led to something good. It's difficult to say, look at the loss of a person, the loss of a loved one, but it led to something good. Those things are, again, bad, but it's something that we can all work on to try to shape difficult things in our life and recognize that they led to something beautiful in the end, or that those difficult things along the way led you to become a different type of person, or led you to something that ultimately was good. So I hope we can all learn from Joseph and from this story in my family, and I'm sure you would have your own stories out there of saying like, oh, this was seemingly bad, or this was something bad, but look, it led to this beautiful thing eventually. I hope we can look at those things in our life and try to focus on them when we encounter something difficult, that ultimately it's for a good reason. And it's going to lead to a good purpose, even though it is difficult and even though it is sad, undeniably. And so I hope you all have a wonderful week and a Shabbat Shalom, and I look forward to speaking with you next time.